My husband's hand was still warm when his mother reached across the casket, grabbed my fingers, and started twisting the wedding ring off them in front of 40 people. The funeral home smelled like lilies and floor polish, the kind of quiet, careful smell that tries to make grief feel smaller than it actually is. I'd been standing at the casket for almost a minute, one hand resting on the edge of the wood, trying to memorize the shape of Daniel's face one last time before they closed it, when Barbara stepped up beside me and reached for my hand like she meant to hold it. "This stays in the family," Barbara Lawson said, prying at my knuckle like she was opening a stuck jar. "You'll understand someday." I didn't fight her. I was too stunned to do anything but stand there, while she slid my ring free and dropped it into her coat pocket, patting the fabric flat, like she'd just finished a chore. A few relatives looked away. Nobody said a word. I remember staring down at my own bare finger, the pale line where the ring had sat for 3 years, feeling more exposed in that single second than I had felt in 11 days of hospital hallways. Then the funeral home's front doors opened, and 4 Marines in dress blues walked in carrying a folded flag and a small wooden case, moving with the kind of purpose that stops a room cold. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Barbara turned to look. The one in front, a woman with silver oak leaves on her collar, scanned the crowd once and found my face immediately. "I'm looking for Captain Mara Lawson," she said. "There's something your husband made sure I'd deliver to you myself, and something else I just watched happen that I need to address before I do." Act 1. Backstory. My name is Mara Lawson. I'm a captain in the United States Marine Corps, currently working logistics out of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. I've been in for 8 years, long enough to have carried more than one folded flag myself, long enough to think I understood grief from every angle a person could stand on. I'd stood in more casualty notification rooms than I could count, delivered more folded flags to more shaking hands than I ever expected, when I first raised my right hand and took the oath at 19. I didn't understand it from this one, not until the day I buried my husband and watched his own mother decide his death was an opportunity to take something of mine. I met Daniel Lawson at a joint training event the year I made first lieutenant. He was a Marine gunnery sergeant, built like someone who'd spent a decade proving himself the hard way, with a laugh that carried across a chow hall and a habit of remembering the smallest details about people he'd only just met. He asked me, on our second real conversation, what my mother used to make me for breakfast before school, and I remember thinking that was a strange question until I realized he actually wanted to know the answer. We spent the next few months finding excuses to end up on the same training rotations, the same weekend duty schedules, the same corner of the same dining facility. He wasn't loud about his feelings the way some men are, all grand gestures and rehearsed lines. He was steady instead, showing up early, remembering birthdays I'd mentioned only once, calling to check on me during a hurricane evacuation even though his own barracks had lost power. By the time he actually asked me to dinner, off base, in real clothes instead of uniforms, I'd already decided I was going to say yes before he finished the sentence. He came from a family that had money, though you'd never have guessed it from how he lived. His father had built a regional chain of car dealerships across the Carolinas before passing years earlier, leaving Barbara in charge of a business empire she ran with a controlling hand and a taste for keeping score. Daniel's older sister, Chelsea, worked the family business alongside her, and between the two of them, they'd built a version of family loyalty that had more to do with obligation than warmth. Daniel described it to me once as a family that measured love in job titles and inheritance shares rather than anything softer, and I came to understand what he meant the longer I spent around them. Daniel had walked away from all of it the day he enlisted, a decision his mother never fully forgave. She wanted her son behind a desk with his name on the building, not overseas carrying a rifle. She used to tell him, at every holiday dinner I sat through, that he was wasting a good mind on a uniform, as though wearing one meant giving something up instead of choosing something. I never fit neatly into that family, and I stopped trying after the first year. Barbara was polished with me in the way people are polished with someone they've already decided doesn't matter long term. Chelsea was worse, cornering me at gatherings to ask, with a smile that never reached her eyes, when I planned to settle down properly once Daniel and I had children, as if my own career were a phase I'd eventually outgrow. I learned to smile back and change the subject, mostly for Daniel's sake, though it cost me something every single time. There was one Thanksgiving, maybe 2 years into our relationship, when Barbara spent the entire meal describing a family friend's daughter who had given up her little job to help run the dealerships full-time, glancing at me between every sentence like she was hoping I'd take the hint. Daniel caught it before I could react, reached under the table, and squeezed my hand hard enough that I understood without a word that he'd noticed too, and that he wasn't going to let it slide the next time it happened. It didn't stop happening. It just became something we learned to survive together, one holiday at a time, trading looks across the table like a private language only the two of us understood. Daniel used to apologize for them quietly, in the car on the drive home from those dinners, running a hand along the back of my neck, and telling me his mother's approval wasn't something either of us needed. "I picked my family the day I put this uniform on," he told me once, "and I picked the rest of it the day I put a ring on you." That ring mattered more than most people understood. Daniel had it custom-made during his final deployment, using money he'd saved from combat pay rather than accept a dime from his mother's business account, which she'd offered more than once as a kind of leash, disguised as generosity. He designed the setting himself, sketching it out on the back of an old letter and mailing the sketch to a jeweler near base rather than trust the decision to anyone else. He had it engraved on the inside band with a short line from the letter he wrote me the week before he proposed, words that meant nothing to anyone who read them except the two of us. It wasn't a family heirloom passed down through generations, whatever Barbara later claimed. It was something he built from nothing, on purpose, because he wanted it to belong entirely to us, and nobody else. We married in a small ceremony near the coast, 3 years before everything changed, with Marines standing in for the family members who didn't bother showing up. Barbara came, technically. She sat in the second row, gave a brief toast about hoping this works out, and left before the cake was cut. Chelsea didn't attend at all, sending a card instead that read more like a business condolence than a congratulations. The years after that were, in their own way, the best of my life, uniform and all. We rented a small house near base with a leaky back porch Daniel never got around to fixing, adopted a dog from a shelter that turned out to be twice as large as advertised, and built a routine that felt like ours in a way nothing with his family ever had. He'd come home from long field exercises smelling like dust and diesel, drop his gear by the door, and pull me into a hug before he'd even taken his boots off, like touching me first was more urgent than anything else waiting on him. On weekends, we'd sit on that crooked back porch with cheap coffee and watch the dog chase things that weren't there, talking about everything and nothing. And I remember thinking more than once that whatever his family had failed to give him, we'd built something sturdier between the two of us to replace it. He kept a running list on the refrigerator of small things he wanted to fix around the house someday, a list that never got shorter no matter how many weekends passed. And I've kept that same piece of paper taped inside a kitchen cabinet ever since, unable to throw it away even though half the items on it will never get done now. Daniel deployed one more time after that, a rotation that was supposed to be routine, the kind of deployment nobody worries about out loud even while everybody worries about it privately. 6 weeks before he was due home, a vehicle he was riding in struck an improvised device during a routine convoy movement. He survived the initial blast, was stabilized at a field hospital, and was flown back stateside for what doctors initially believed would be a long but survivable recovery. He held on for 11 days in a hospital outside Bethesda. I was there for every one of them, sleeping in the same chair by his bed, memorizing the sound of every machine keeping him alive. The nurses on that ward learned my name within the first 2 days and started saving me the good coffee from the break room without my asking. Barbara came for parts of 3 of those days, spending most of that time on her phone in the hallway handling calls from the dealership, stepping back into the room only long enough to ask the attending doctor questions about the prognosis in a tone that sounded more like due diligence than fear. Chelsea sent flowers to the wrong hospital and never corrected the mistake, a detail I only found out about because a nurse mentioned it in passing weeks later. I remember one afternoon, around day 7, when Barbara sat beside the bed for almost 20 minutes without saying anything, watching Daniel's chest rise and fall under the blankets. I thought for a moment that grief had finally cracked something open in her, that she was seeing her son the way I saw him instead of the way she'd always wanted him to be. Then she looked over at me and asked quietly whether I'd thought about what would happen to his things if the worst happened. I didn't have an answer for her that day. I wish now I'd understood what she was really asking. On the 11th day, Daniel died from complications the doctors had warned me about, but never fully prepared me for. He was 34, a husband, and, though almost nobody in his family understood the full weight of it, a Marine whose actions during that convoy strike, pulling 2 wounded men clear of a burning vehicle before help arrived, had already been quietly forwarded up the chain for formal review. I buried my husband not knowing his mother would try to walk away from that funeral with more than just her grief. ACT-2, the incident. The trouble started the morning of the viewing, hours before the casket was even closed, when Barbara pulled me aside near the funeral home's private family room and told me, in the tone she used for business meetings, that she'd been thinking about keeping things simple going forward. I asked what she meant. She said the ring Daniel had given me was, in her words, clearly a family piece, and that she thought it would be best for everyone if it stayed where it belonged once the service was over. I told her, as gently as I could manage on the worst day of my life, that Daniel had bought that ring himself, designed it himself, and given it to me with his own hands. She smiled the way she always smiled at me, thin and patient, like she was waiting for a child to finish an argument she'd already won. I didn't think much more about it that morning. Grief has a way of making you assume the worst conversations are behind you, rather than ahead of you. I went and sat with the casket instead, straightening Daniel's uniform ribbons for the 3rd time, even though they hadn't moved, because it gave my hands something to do besides shake. The viewing itself went on for 2 hours before anything happened. Marines from Daniel's unit filled half the room, standing in small clusters, telling each other quiet stories about him that made me laugh and cry within the same breath. One young corporal told me Daniel had once given him his own boots during a field exercise after his had fallen apart, walking the rest of the week in a spare pair 2 sizes too small, rather than let a junior Marine suffer through it. Another Marine, a staff sergeant with a deep scar along one forearm, told me Daniel had covered his duty shift without being asked the week his wife went into early labor, driving 2 hours each way afterward, just to make sure the man got to see his newborn daughter before the sun came up. Hearing stories like that, one after another, was the only thing keeping me upright. Barbara worked the room like she was hosting a fundraiser, accepting condolences with a composed nod, occasionally glancing toward the casket in a way that should have told me something. Chelsea stayed close to her the whole time, whispering things I couldn't hear, the 2 of them exchanging looks I was too numb to interpret correctly. Near the end of the viewing, as the room thinned out and only close family remained, Barbara approached the casket with me for what I thought was a final private moment. She reached over, took my left hand gently at first, and told me she wanted to see the ring one more time before it goes into the ground with him, a request that struck me as strange but not yet alarming. I remember thinking, in that half second, that she was finally softening, reaching for some small shared moment of grief between the 2 of us. Then her grip tightened. She began twisting the ring off my finger with a determination that told me this had never been about seeing it. Chelsea stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching without a flicker of surprise, which told me she'd known this was the plan all along. Whatever conversation the 2 of them had shared before that moment, this was the outcome they'd already agreed on. "This stays in the family," Barbara said, sliding it free of my knuckle. "You'll understand someday." I stood there, stunned into silence, watching my own wedding ring disappear into my mother-in-law's coat pocket in front of the small crowd that remained. A cousin near the back looked away. An aunt suddenly found something urgent in her purse. Nobody stepped forward. My finger felt strange and bare, the pale mark where the ring had sat for 3 years, suddenly the only thing I could focus on. I found my voice eventually, though it came out smaller than I wanted. I told Barbara that ring was mine, that Daniel had made it for me, that it had nothing to do with the family business or the family name. She patted my arm, the same gesture she used when ending conversations with employees who'd overstepped, and told me we could discuss logistics another time, as though my wedding ring were a line item on a spreadsheet, rather than the last physical thing my husband had ever placed on my body with his own hands. I called my closest friend from flight school that night, a Navy nurse named Denise Foster, who had talked me through worse days than I thought existed before that week. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone pressed to my ear, still wearing my black dress from the viewing, too exhausted to change into anything else. I told her everything, the ring, the coat pocket, the cousin who looked away. She'd known Daniel for years too, had been a bridesmaid at our small courthouse wedding, and I could hear the anger creeping into her voice even through the phone as I described what had happened. She went quiet for a long moment before telling me something I hadn't considered. "Mara," she said, "Daniel's unit is still handling his personal effects paperwork. If that ring was ever documented anywhere as belonging to you, there's a record of it somewhere that has nothing to do with his mother's opinion. Call his command. Don't wait." I didn't call that night. Grief and exhaustion won out, and I told myself I'd deal with it after the funeral. That fighting over jewelry while my husband's body hadn't even been buried felt like a betrayal of everything that actually mattered. I lay awake most of that night instead, staring at the ceiling, running my thumb over the bare spot on my finger where the ring should have been, wondering if I was overreacting to grief-driven behavior from a woman who had just lost her son. I was wrong about that. Waiting nearly cost me more than a ring. The morning of the funeral, before the service began, Chelsea found me in the parking lot and made it clear the family's plans didn't stop at the ring. She leaned against my car door, arms crossed, watching a line of Marines file into the chapel across the lot, and mentioned, almost casually, that Barbara intended to request Daniel's remaining personal effects. His uniform decorations, his personal letters, even the small wooden box he kept his combat gear mementos in, be transferred to the family estate rather than left with me, on the grounds that she was his real family, and I was, in Chelsea's exact words, a chapter, not the whole book. I stood there in the parking lot in my funeral clothes, watching my breath fog in the cold morning air, and felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with grief anymore. Chelsea walked back toward the chapel without waiting for a response, apparently satisfied she'd delivered her message, her heels clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that somehow managed to sound smug even from a distance. That was the moment I finally called Daniel's command, hands shaking too hard to dial the number twice before it connected. I got through to a staff sergeant who transferred me immediately once I explained the situation, and within the hour I was on the phone with someone I hadn't expected to hear from that week at all, Colonel Renata Owen, Daniel's commanding officer, who told me, in a voice both calm and unmistakably sharp, that she was already aware of a personal effects situation involving my husband, and that she'd be at the service herself that afternoon. "Don't worry about the ring today," she told me before hanging up. "Worry about getting through the service. I'll handle the rest." I walked into that funeral not knowing what handling the rest would look like, only that for the first time in 2 days, I didn't feel entirely alone in the fight I hadn't even realized I was already in. ACT 3, The Reckoning. I didn't know what handle the rest meant until the funeral home's front doors opened partway through the reception that followed the burial, and 4 Marines in dress blues walked in carrying a folded flag and a small wooden case. The reception hall had been quiet up to that point, filled with the low murmur of people picking at catered food they weren't hungry for, the kind of muted conversation that fills a room after a burial. Someone had set up a small table with photographs of Daniel through the years, as a kid on a fishing trip, in his dress uniform at graduation, laughing at our wedding with his tie already loosened. I'd been standing near that table for several minutes, unable to eat anything off the plate someone had handed me, when the front doors opened. Barbara stood near the center of the room, accepting condolences again, the ring's absence from my hand apparently already forgotten by everyone except me. She'd changed into a different black dress for the reception, one I recognized as considerably more expensive than anything she'd worn to the viewing, and I remember thinking, in a distant, numb way, that grief looked different on people depending on how much money they had to spend dressing for it. Colonel Owen led the group in, scanning the room until she found me standing near the back wall, still stunned from the burial, still feeling the strange, hollow absence where my ring used to sit. She crossed the room directly, ignoring the murmurs that followed her, and stopped in front of Barbara before she even reached me. I noticed, even in that moment, how the other 3 Marines fanned out slightly behind her without being told, forming a quiet half-circle that made it clear this wasn't a casual visit. "Mrs. Lawson," she said, "I understand you removed something from your daughter-in-law's hand at the viewing yesterday." The room went quiet almost instantly, conversations dying mid-sentence as people turned to watch. Barbara's composure slipped for the first time since I'd known her, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she recovered it. "That ring is a family piece," she said. "It belongs with us." Colonel Owen didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every person in that room was already leaning in to hear what came next. That ring was custom designed and purchased by your son using his own combat pay 18 months before he died, she said. I know that because I approved the leave request he used to have it made, and because he told me himself what it meant to him. It was never a family piece. It was a gift, freely given to his wife. She opened the small wooden case she was carrying and pulled out a sealed envelope. Your son also updated his record of emergency data 8 months ago, naming Captain Lawson as the sole recipient of his personal effects, including any items of personal property in his possession or gifted by him. That's a federal document, Mrs. Lawson. It doesn't leave room for family opinion, and it doesn't leave room for taking things off a grieving widow's hand in front of a room full of witnesses. Barbara's jaw tightened. She looked around the room, seeming to notice for the first time how many people were watching her, how many faces held the same quiet shock I'd felt watching my ring disappear into her pocket the day before. Even Chelsea, standing close beside her, had gone very still. I don't see why this needs to happen here, Barbara said, her voice thinner than before. It's happening here, Colonel Owen said, because it happened here. You took something from her at a viewing, in front of family, and I intend to correct that, in front of the same people who watched it happen. Barbara reached into her coat pocket, slower now, some of the certainty draining from her face as the room's attention settled fully on her. She placed the ring into Colonel Owen's open palm without another word, her hand trembling slightly as she did it. The colonel turned and handed it to me herself, closing my fingers gently around it. Her expression softened for the first time since she'd walked in. Your husband asked me, before that deployment, to make sure this reached you no matter what happened to him, she said. He didn't say why he thought that might be necessary. I understand now. I slid the ring back onto my finger with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, the metal still warm from where it had sat against Barbara's palm. Chelsea, standing near her mother, tried one last time to argue that the family had context the Marines didn't understand, that this was a private matter that didn't belong at a funeral reception. You don't know what our family has been through, she said, looking around at the gathered Marines like she expected them to back down. A few relatives near her shifted uncomfortably, and I noticed, for the first time that day, that not everyone in that family had been as blind to what was happening as I'd assumed. One older cousin actually spoke up, quietly, telling Chelsea that maybe it was time to let the matter rest. A small act of courage that came about a day too late to matter, but meant something to me anyway. That was when Gunnery Sergeant Elliot Voss, who had served alongside Daniel for years and had been quiet until that moment, stepped forward with something else from the wooden case. He was a broad-shouldered man with a quiet, steady presence, the kind of Marine who commanded a room simply by standing in it. There's one more thing your brother wanted delivered, he said, looking at Chelsea and Barbara both. A letter he wrote before that last deployment. In case he didn't come home. He asked that it be read to his family, not just kept private. He handed me the letter instead of them, and I understood immediately why Daniel had trusted his unit with it rather than his own mother. My hands trembled as I broke the seal, recognizing his handwriting instantly, the same slanted scrawl he used for grocery lists and love notes alike. In it, he'd written plainly about the distance between himself and his family, about choosing a life of service over a life behind a desk, and about the one thing he hoped Barbara would someday understand, that loving someone means letting them choose their own path, not measuring their worth against the plans you had for them. He wrote about me too, about the ring, about wanting me to have something that was entirely mine no matter what happened to him, something no one could ever tell me I hadn't earned. I read only a portion of it aloud that day, my voice breaking twice, while Barbara sat in a chair near the back wall with her hands pressed against her face. Whatever argument she still had left in her seemed to leave the room along with the last line of that letter. A few of the relatives who had looked away during the viewing now sat with tears on their faces, finally understanding what they'd witnessed the day before. One woman I barely recognized, an aunt on Daniel's father's side, came up to me afterward and apologized quietly for not saying anything sooner, admitting she'd noticed the ring disappear and told herself it wasn't her place to interfere. I told her it was all right, though at the time I didn't fully mean it. Colonel Owen closed things out simply, her voice carrying that same steady authority it had held from the moment she walked in. Staff Sergeant Voss will be in touch about finalizing the personal effects transfer through proper channels, she said. There won't be another incident like yesterday's. I'll make sure of that myself. ACT-4. After months passed before the dust from that funeral fully settled, though the ring never left my hand again after that afternoon. Barbara didn't contest the personal effects transfer once Colonel Owen's office followed up in writing. Gunnery Sergeant Voss handled most of the paperwork himself over the following weeks, driving out personally to deliver the wooden box of Daniel's mementos rather than trust it to a courier, along with a folder documenting what had been designated to me and why. Barbara signed everything without argument. Whatever fight she'd had left seeming to have gone out of her the moment she heard Daniel's own words read back to her in a room full of witnesses. I remember watching Voss carry that box up my front steps and thinking how strange it was that a stranger in uniform had shown more care handling my husband's memory than his own mother had managed in 11 days at a hospital bedside. She did, eventually, send me a letter of her own, stiff and formal at first, the kind of letter written by someone unused to admitting fault. She wrote that she'd let old resentment about Daniel's career choices color how she treated our marriage from the very beginning, that watching him choose the Marine Corps over the family business had felt, to her, like a rejection of everything she'd built, and that she'd taken that rejection out on me instead of on him, because he was gone and I wasn't. It wasn't a full apology. There was no mention of the ring itself, no acknowledgement of what it felt like to have it pulled off my hand in front of relatives who looked away instead of stepping in. But it was closer than I ever expected to get from her, and for a long time, I let that be enough. Chelsea, for her part, never reached out at all, which told me more about her than any apology could have. I heard through a mutual relative, months later, that she'd left the family business not long after the funeral, moving to another state for reasons nobody in the family seemed willing to discuss out loud. I never asked for details. Some doors are better left closed than pried open out of curiosity. Daniel's actions during that convoy strike were formally recognized the following spring. A posthumous award ceremony held on base with his unit, standing in formation, and Colonel Owen presenting the case to me directly, along with a folded flag I now keep on a shelf beside our wedding photo. The ceremony was small, held on a gray morning with a light wind coming off the water, but it felt enormous to me, standing there in my own dress uniform, watching his name read aloud in front of the people who actually knew what he'd done that day on the convoy route. I invited Barbara to that ceremony, more out of a sense of obligation to Daniel than any real desire to see her again. She came, sat quietly near the back, and left before the reception, which felt, oddly, like the most honest thing she'd done in years. We exchanged a brief hug afterward, stiff and careful, the kind of gesture two people make when they've decided to stop fighting without ever quite becoming close. It wasn't warmth, it was something smaller and more fragile than that, but it was real. Gunnery Sergeant Voss and I stayed in touch longer than I expected, mostly through short messages checking in around the holidays. He told me once, almost in passing, that Daniel had talked about that ring more than any other Marine talks about jewelry, describing to anyone who'd listen how he wanted the engraving to look, laughing about how nervous he'd been mailing that sketch to a jeweler he'd never met in person. He also mentioned that Daniel used to keep a photograph of me tucked inside his helmet liner, something I hadn't known until that message arrived, and something that undid me more than I expected a small detail like that to. Hearing that made the ring feel even more like what it always was. Not a family heirloom to be fought over, but a promise Daniel had made and kept, even after he was gone. I stayed in the Marine Corps, promoted the following winter, carrying Daniel's ring on a chain around my neck during field exercises, when regulations meant I couldn't wear it on my hand. There's a particular comfort in feeling that small weight against my chest during long days in the field, a reminder that whatever else changes, that piece of him stays close. My promotion ceremony was small, held in a conference room on base, and I found myself glancing toward the door partway through, half expecting to see Barbara slip in quietly, the way she had at Daniel's award ceremony. She didn't come that day, and I found I didn't mind as much as I once might have. Some relationships settle into something smaller than reconciliation, and I've made peace with that. I adopted a second dog that spring, a scruffy mutt from the same shelter where Daniel and I had found our first one, mostly because the house felt too quiet without something else moving through it besides me. The new dog sleeps on Daniel's side of the bed most nights, which felt strange for about a week before it started feeling like the most natural thing in the world. On quieter nights, I still take out the wooden box Gunnery Sergeant Voss eventually delivered in full, Daniel's letters, his old dog tags, a photograph of the two of us from the day he proposed. And I read that last letter again, the one his family heard for the first time in a funeral home reception hall, the one that reminded all of us what he actually valued, long after anyone stopped asking him to explain it. I've read it enough times now that I could recite it from memory, but I never do. I always pull out the paper itself, worn soft at the folds, because some things deserve to be held rather than simply remembered. The ring sits on my finger now, engraved on the inside with words only I fully understand, right where he meant for it to stay. If this story reached you the way it reached me while I was living through it, drop one word in the comments below that describes what you felt watching that ring disappear into someone else's pocket. Some families teach you what loyalty looks like by showing you, quietly, over years, who actually shows up when it counts. Other families only show you the truth once someone forces them to look at it directly, in a room full of people who already knew but never said anything until it was almost too late. I think about that reception hall often, the silence of the relatives who looked away, and how much easier that moment would have been for everyone if just one of them had spoken up before the Marines had to. And if this story reminded you that the people who truly love us don't measure that love against a life plan they never agreed to, subscribe. Because tomorrow, I'm telling you about an everyone blamed me for the death, until his commander revealed why he had protected me. I'll see you there.